It is a dark and stormy night here at Casa del AJ Pickett, and you are tuned in to an off-script broadcast where I'm just going to talk about role-playing games. Mostly Dungeons & Dragons, but the bets are off. I don't have to talk about just Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to talk about storytelling. I'm going to be talking about encounter building, world building, tips and tricks for gameplay, different things that you can bring to your game. And the intention really is just me opening up my years of experience playing the game and to inspire you. If you can make it 20 minutes through this and you're planning a campaign or even just a one-shot session and you don't come up with something that connects the dots that may not have been connected before, then I've failed my mission and you can safely avoid these in future. But if you do get some inspiration from this, let me know. Okay, I've got 3 pages of notes here that I've made over the last couple of days. And I've been talking with other people as well and getting their feedback on various things. Currently on Twitter is a somewhat trolly post of mine, which was asking, why do people roll dice for saving throws for non-player characters that are under their control? I'm thinking sometimes NPCs should fail saving throws automatically just as a demonstration of what not to do, or that something is dangerous, or there's traps around here, or those creatures can kill you by staring at you, that sort of thing. That's the same function that the red security guards on Star Trek have. They don't roll saving throws, they just die, and then the fun is figuring out what killed them. So, to begin, really what I'm going to talk about is the brunt of this broadcast will be talking about dynamic connections. Dynamic connections link different elements in encounters and world building. So, the world, when we talk about world building, incorporates the setting. It's not just a planet. It may be a plane of existence. It may be a spaceship that you're traveling or through some cosmos on. It may be Terry Pratchett's Discworld. It may be a science fiction setting. So you've got to think about, is it a plane of existence? What sort of rules does it have for gravity, atmosphere, meteors, radiation? Are there even gods there? Does dimensional stuff matter? Are there portals that naturally occur? Like in Dungeons & Dragons, you have portals to the Feywild or Shadowfell, or planet portals through people being able to mystically elevate themselves to the astral plane and then go to outer planes of existence, maybe mentally. So that sort of thing. We've got to think about the immediate environment of those planes as well. What's the terrain, the general terrain that the game is taking place in? Are you in a big mountain range area? Do mountains sort of dominate the land? Or is it a series of archipelago islands that involve a lot of sea travel? Or even hot air balloons? Maybe there's no ground at all. You're in a series of floating islands in the elemental plane of air, and this is just normal for you. Maybe the weather in the specific location is a major factor. Are you in a place where sudden storms can hit and you need to find shelter under the ground wherever you happen to be located? So, you end up dungeon delving by necessity. Is it a specific type of ecosystem? Are you in some sort of a nightmare swamp, the jungles of Katachan or Chult or something like that? The ecosystem of those places take precedence. The Lake of Steam on faerun's lower southern border has some really interesting flora and fauna there that I guess you get to understand. Are you in a Sea of Fallen Stars adventure where you spend most of your time underwater, only making brief forays onto the surface because you're all playing Tritons and Merfolk and stuff? These things can make a huge difference to your game. The distance and remoteness of the player characters in their settings from major cities and things like that may play a huge part as well. There may be resources that are just scarce because nobody's manufacturing them. The climate and general conditions of desert regions or alpine regions, Arctic, snowy regions. In Game of Thrones, for instance, the weather plays a huge part in that story. The people of the frozen north are faced with the constant reality of hard winter and what winter entails and the hardship it entails. And the whole world goes into an extended period of winter and an extended period of summer. They don't have normal cycles of seasons like they have on planet Earth. When it goes winter, the entire planet goes winter for an extended period of time, like a year or so. So and at which point the spectre of the undead marching through the snow becomes very real. Is the local area got some specific type of terrain that's quite important? Is it a volcanic, geothermally active area? Does it support lots of different specific ecosystems? So, for instance, if it's a geothermically active area, there's going to be parts of the terrain that humans just don't want to inhabit, but it may form a perfect location to house some grung or lizard folk quite close to that human population. What effect has it had on that population's history, both the lizard folk and the humans or humanoids? What sort of influence has it had with that blending of cultures? Are they at constant war with each other, or have they blended somewhat? Structures and things like that in the terrain are also really important. Case in point is the Avatar world, where you had a gravity hotspot where magnetic forces and things cause these incredibly flying earth motes that are linked up by huge vines and things like that. Fantastic terrain can also include massive trees, like their home tree, for instance, or an elven tree of huge age and importance that may be semi-awakened and have mystical properties of its own. It may form a natural portal to the Feywild, which is vulnerable because it's alive. So the inhabitants of these places could include the plants, the animals, maybe specifically located there, like the Tressum of Cormyr, for instance. You don't find winged cats in the Shar, but you may find wemmicks and other cat folk. There may be monsters that are specific to a particular area, so it may be that in your game the only place you find minotaurs are on a certain chain of islands and they're just not found anywhere else. The humanoids may be restricted and located on specific parts of the world and they just don't travel elsewhere. It may a lot of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about is not just, I'll use a lot of established world settings, but I do most of my gameplay just through homebrew. So I'll be talking to the people who are making your own worlds as well. Constructs are also creatures, when you think about it. Constructs can exist well and truly past the lifespan of whoever created them in the first place, and they may be set on tasks that are relatively innocuous but have long-term consequences. So, for instance, constructs set to build a border wall between two nations that no longer exist may create a geographical feature of such magnitude that it actually creates a significant barrier and even alter the weather of that world. So, these things can just work tirelessly for centuries. Spirits, the undead. What happens in a place where lots of necromancers have raised lots of dead people, wights and zombies and things like that, and animated objects and stuff, and then some disaster befalls that civilization, say a plague or some such, and the ruins that they've left behind are occupied solely by reasonably peaceful undead who are possibly a bit more self-aware than usual. Elementals are also a major factor in many different worlds. They are a different strata of life. They occupy matter itself. They don't have the same needs or wants or hungers or desires, but they may have politics and take umbrage to people disrupting what they do. So all of these things take into effect the area, the immediate area, the environment, and the world in general. Then we get down to specific encounters. And what's an encounter? An encounter is a scene. It's where something changes or takes place. It's the location that you describe something happening. Really, a lot of the gameplay in Dungeons & Dragons and other games can be skipped where it involves traveling from scene to scene. In fact, finding out which scene to travel to, or how to get there, or where you need to go to have that scene is the travel scene itself. The investigation is part of the travel. So, and it may involve scenes where clues are uncovered. So there's a lot of puzzle solving and things like that. And my first tip, my first bit of major advice for dungeon masters and game masters everywhere is that if you have a great idea for an adventure, for a scene, for a location for something to take place, that's fantastic, really mind-blowing, and really transports the players into the realm of fantasy that they signed up for when they decided to play a role-playing game in the first place. Don't string them along and make them go marching off through various hoops to find it. Unless those hoops are really engaging, throw that scene at them, the one that really excites you as a dungeon master, the one that got your blood sort of pumping to get to that exciting part of the story. Bring that excitement to them as quickly as possible. Limit the steps between A and B, and then just pile on more and more exciting and interesting scenes after that. It's okay to be fantastical. This is a fantasy story that we're telling. You can build your world as a series of encounters that the characters are going to discover what's going on in the story, get to a conclusion of something, or it can be an exploration where there really isn't any world-shattering thing which is happening right at the start of the game that the players are aware of. So they literally are motivated just by what their characters would do. So, and also when you're looking at the player characters, don't forget that there's a whole world of other player characters. There's a group of people who are playing the game at the moment as, say, a cleric and a wizard and a ranger and a fighter. But there's also thieves and monks and warlocks and things like that in the world that have their organizations and things, and those are just as active whether or not there's a player character involved or not. You'll encounter these sorcerers and individuals in bars and taverns and traveling to interesting locations. In fact, the closer you get to sites of adventure, the more likely you are to encounter them as NPCs, when you think about it. So that's interesting. There is probably a bit of rivalry between fighters or wizards and things like that when they meet each other. There may be specific sort of mores and rituals and taboos and courtesies that are involved, and it's okay to let your player take the lead a little bit and describe what those specific things are for that culture, that character class in the game, because when they're playing one of those characters, they're kind of heroing that character class, and you can let them take a bit more lead in the story and describe what sort of relationship they had with their wizard academy or fighting training dojo or ludus or wherever it was that they get their martial skill from. A lot of times, and this is my second bit of advice for you, the players will aim towards having a character that has got very little things which are attaching their character and like sinking them into the story, because that game world, they're not aware of what's going on in that game world, and there's a bit of anxiety there of like, if I tell this big backstory for my character, is it actually going to gel with what the game master or dungeon master had in mind? Maybe they don't really want to go into that much detail and just let the character evolve as the story does. So it's your job in many ways as the dungeon master to take an active role in the character's background. So it's okay to introduce NPCs and things and say that those NPCs have a personal connection with that player character. And it's also okay to ask questions like, when you two both met, your two player character individuals, what was your first argument? What shared loathing do you have? What shared interest do you have that's outside of your normal character class type stuff? Like, do you both love a particular card game or something like that? And that gives them links and leads that they will generally leap onto, because you're giving them something which they can wrap their head around from the outset. And it gives them that license to invest in the game world themselves. They get to write their little bit of the story. So when it comes down to encounters, I like to include a lot of different things. Like I keep in mind that the location is just as important as whatever creatures or living things or interactive objects are there. So the location itself is a creature, is an interactive event. It's a dynamic thing that changes and moves. There may be time-based events such as the building's on fire. If you don't finish the fight and get out of there in time, burning rafters are going to fall on you. The floor will give way. You may be involved in some sort of magical event which is running amok because somebody started a fight with the wizard halfway through their ritual, and now they've lost control of some sort of summoning magic and a portal is ripping open. Interaction-based events are where the event is possible to be modified. So a time-based event can take place whether the player characters are trying to stop it or not. and some of them can be stopped. So, for instance, if you need to pull a lever to stop to close a valve to stop a sewer system from flooding, for instance, you'll need to take time out from the combat to send your character over there to actually physically turn that thing, at which point you're one person down in that adventurer party against whatever denizens are fighting you in that location. At the same time, there may be piranhas which are flowing in with the water which is flooding in from the river outside. The water itself may be toxic. It may have some steam or something that's obscuring the terrain and causing more difficulty for ranged attacks. And of course, the mobility of travelling around an ever-increasing depth of water is something that you need to factor in as well. Static objects and terrain form like obstacles, like the terrain is difficult because it's muddy, or there's a channel in the middle of the sewer room that is really deep and possibly dangerous. There's a large sleeping crocodile on the other side of the room, which may or may not wake up. There's bars, which are in the middle of the corridor that you need to get through somehow. There's a pit that you know where it is, but it still forms an obstacle. There's a rope bridge. There's a cliff face. There's a thick, dense area of brambles. Not just like a minor inconvenience of brambles, but brambles it can actually damage you and your equipment if you travel through it without being very careful. So interactive objects and terrain can feed off each other. So a perfect example is a turning corridor. So the corridor actually spins around and connects and forms a different connection in the dungeon. So when the player characters go back to that area, it's shifted and changed. Same thing with dimensional shifting in landscapes. This is particularly popular in Rifts, for instance, the role-playing game. But it can be just as possible in somewhere like the Feywild, where interacting Fey lords and ladies or individual stories that are domains in the Feywild actually intersect and cross over and move. So as the Feylord moves, the terrain changes with their story. So they're a theme and a domain, almost like they're a mobile domain of dread. It's like if Strahd picked up and moved to the middle of Faerun, the area around Strahd would turn into a Faerunian version of Barovia, just because that's the influence that he has. That sort of thing. And of course, interactive objects and terrain can form traps and puzzles in and of themselves. A perfect example is you need to figure out from the hieroglyphs on the wall that the colour yellow was highly important to this religion of these lizard folk. And if you look around, there's a yellow powder which must be heaped into a bowl as an offering to the correct god if you interpret some footprints in the mud and things like that and put two and two together. Meanwhile, there's a time-based event where there's these sort of monstrous spiders which are going to be hatching very soon because the lizard folk dumped some captured halflings there as a sacrifice to the spiders in the area. The lizard folk, of course, are keeping a safe distance, but they consider anybody who's been in this area to be a sacrifice, and trying to leave there would be like a sacrifice taken away from their gods. And so that would be a taboo, and they would do their best to throw them back in there. So there's lots of things going on there, lots of dynamic and static and time-based events. Active inhabitants and passive inhabitants. Passive inhabitants would be a roper that is really old and tired and doesn't actually do anything until you climb on it, and then it wakes up and decides that it's hungry. Or an active inhabitant would be something like a cave crawler monster which is stalking you, and when you leave the dungeon, it actually goes out of the dungeon after you and follows you back to town. Like, for instance, a band of chokers, I see no reason why they wouldn't follow some adventurers back to a town and nab them in the inn room when they're sleeping at night. Sequences of interactions are also really good. So puzzles are a perfect example of, do this, figure out that, then do this, and it will unlock the key to this. That's a perfect A, B, C, D puzzle sequence interaction. Other sequences of interactions are based on the character's involvement in the scene. So if they don't do something, they may not set off a chain of events. For example, the kobold that they've recruited as a scout may be perfectly loyal and great as a scout until they get within proximity of a dragon or some dragonborn or something like that, which sets off the obsessive nature of the kobolds to double cross any non-draconic being in favour of winning some points with whatever those draconic beings are. So that's one of the things I quite often do. Single triggers and traps, of course, is challenges, checks, and triggers. So these are things you need to make saving throws for, or use your skills and abilities to detect them and highlight the wondrous things that your character class can do. And here's my third tip for you. Every skill that the character has is a passive skill check, potentially. Not just their perception, but their ability to use for survival skills, blacksmithing, diplomacy, intimidation. They can passively intimidate somebody. So as the character, and also you don't need to roll for everything that this character can do. Sometimes you just need to highlight, oh yeah, your character is so skilled at picking locks that I'm not even going to roll for it. Just describe how you open it and just cross off some resources on your character sheet, and you just do it, because your character is an expert and they should have the ability to shine. One perfect example of that is, instead of getting the player to roll the skill check, get them to describe some part of their character's history, their backstory, where they learned that skill in the first place. And based on the telling of that story, whether it involving local NPCs that are woven into their story, or they create new aspects of their character which you can use as a dungeon master to tie them into that game world in particular, or things that reveal the motivations and internal thoughts and dialogues and motivation of that character through their history, these things should be rewarded and essentially say, yep, you pass, you do it. And it also gives them an interesting little moment to shine and tell an anecdote about their character, because everybody likes to talk about their character. Terminal events, they cause serious blockages, or they redirect the story. So this can be a cave-in. This can be the chambers have flooded and you can't go back that way anymore. The corridor has shifted position. You're in a new Feywild realm now until you figure out how to get out. These sort of things. So these can be interactive. They could be triggered by the character's actions, or they could just be time-based events, or a sequence of events where one thing has led to another and things have changed now. When the characters are first going off on their adventure, think about what they've learned. And here's my fourth tip for you. Is it generally known legends and myths about this particular area? How accurate is the story of the Minotaur, for instance? Or what does anybody really know about an aboleth? Do they even know the aboleth exist? For many years, people were assumed to play characters that had no idea that the drow even existed until they encountered them. They may be a local folklore, and this is where lore and records come in. Has anybody actually recorded anything, and do you have access to those recordings? Books are not as knowledge is not as accessible in a medieval world, or even a fantasy world, but it's there probably if you go looking for it. So characters who are bards and things like that, who have those legend lore type abilities, have certain advantages where they may actually learn what's written and recorded about particular monsters and things. However, it's a double-edged sword, and this is where folklore and hearsay come in as well. Anybody can ask a peasant on the side of the road who's ploughing his turnips what they know about werewolves. How much of that information that they give them is actually going to be accurate? And how much of what you are assuming your character knows about werewolves is actually from movies and things that you've seen that you assume werewolves are like? So, for instance, if you think zombies eat brains, and you get to the Dungeons and Dragons world, and your character assumes that the zombies eat brains, like, why? There's no folklore to support it, because zombies in Dungeons and Dragons generally don't eat brains. But what if they do? What if it is transmitted by some sort of a virus or something like that? What if it is a magical curse? These sort of things. It can be a time-based thing as well. In the Chult adventure, Tomb of Annihilation, the ability to heal and resurrect people gets switched off due to the effects of an artifact in the area. In one of the Dungeons and Dragons movies, which shall live forever in infamy, that is a death curse that happens to one of the wizards. She slowly decays before people's eyes. So these are things to take into account. Now, I've got lots of tips and tricks here, little bullet points that I wanted to cover. And by this point, we're about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes into this recording. Hopefully, I should have inspired you with some connections there with your adventure making that will have set you off in a different mental tangent. Right, so players make disconnected characters out of anxiety. As I mentioned before, they have an anxiety about not having a full understanding of the world that their character is built for, because they don't want to sit down and listen to the Dungeon Master expound for hours at a time on the world building that they've done. Realize, as a Dungeon Master, that you are inexorably going to be drawn to overworking your world building, and it is always a temptation to have any excuse to expound on the details of this world to the players before they've even started playing the game. This is a mistake for two reasons. One, it's going to put them to sleep because you're actively engaging their imagination without any sort of interaction. So effectively, you're hypnotizing them. You're building a dream picture in their head that they don't get to interact with. So they just passively experience it until they go into La La Land. You're telling them a lullaby. So you need to give them the ability to interact from the very get-go. So they need to have an active part in the world building with you. So I recommend only world building to a point. Always leave plenty of room for the player characters in your game and their active ability to tell you how Thieves Guilds work, how Wizard Academies work. Maybe they want to play an adventure where magic is dangerous. So they have the ability to say, okay, maybe when I roll a wild magic check, it could cause a physical mutation. But on the other hand, to offset that extra huge risk, maybe give me an extra spell slot. And you can negotiate these sort of things. This is what you do when you're sitting down and playing a game with a group. You make up your own rules. And this is one of the great things about the game. Never be afraid to do that. You can change the rules per session. Always, as a player, feel free to negotiate a little bit. Keep a copy of each of your character sheets for your players. Keep them as the Dungeon Master. So note what each of those passive skill checks are, because there's always the potential for a skill check to be passive. Roll for players who have characters that may spot secret doors or game trails or all sorts of different things. Look at those angles. Consider what your character's ability scores are. Characters with high wisdom have a very observant nature. And one thing you'll notice in the world is that people will listen to people and follow the directions of people who have a proven track record of being switched on and seeing what's going on around them. Wisdom is more important than charisma when it comes to leading a group. That's why clerics have very high wisdom and generally will be trusted voices in their community. Assume that the characters know some NPCs, non-player characters, and can do some stuff without rolls, as I mentioned. Assume that a thief will have some shady connections in the town that they can move goods. Assume that rangers will know some local guides or scouts or game trails off the beaten track, may know some caches of weapons equipment, may know where to get certain types of herbs and alchemical components, or may know some legends and lore and folklore from people that they've met who are foresters or itinerant workers and things like that. Masons are a perfect example of a power group in the medieval world because their skills were so valued for fortification and building that they travelled widely and they generally had a protected status. Their skills were so highly sought after that they were given almost a mystical status so that they could bless people, you know. It was almost like a religion. Not everything the characters know or are told by NPCs and resources is true. They may get led down a merry path by essentially a snake oil peddler who tells them that the magical potion that they just bought is in fact the real deal, when in actual fact it's not. It may do something different. And it gives you all sorts of opportunities to come up with some weird and crazy potions and things. Maybe a healing potion heals you, but it heals you in a non-conforming way. So you've just ingested parasites, which give you a temporary regeneration ability. So perhaps it's a potion that keeps on giving for a limited time, but it might have some serious side effects. It's okay to narrate a discovery. Not all the things the DM says has to be clues and rules related. So sit back and tell them what it's like to be looking over the Ramtop Mountains. Tell them about the sunrise in the morning. Tell them what the air smells like. Tell them how treacherous the game trail was. Tell them about local flora and fauna that have nothing to do with the adventure at hand, but is just interesting. Sometimes it's okay to just sit back and regale them with some storytelling. This is the bit of the world building that they really enjoy. It gets them centered. It gets them thinking about what sort of stone that the structure is made of, or what sort of alleyways and sewer systems and flora and fauna and the clothing styles and the language inflections of the people who live in the city. It's okay to describe what the street food is without the necessity of them actually going and sampling any of it. You know, you can talk about the smell of fish stew in Bremen and or Bryn Shander in the Icewind Dale region. You know, that sort of thing. What's it like walking through a blizzard on the plains and the rolling hills as you enter 10 Towns? Can you smell the scent of a yeti on the wind without being able to see it? That raises that anxiety, you know? Or the Chewingas, the ice Chewingas waving their arms at you in warning because there's remores ahead. Bring the awesome stuff as soon as you can, as I mentioned. If you've got an idea of a monster encounter, it should happen pretty much straight away. You can get through a lot of the dull trudgery by just skipping over a lot of the travel across the wilderness. Things don't happen unless they happen. Just use up trail rations and stuff and say, it's been a couple of days, you know, of travel, and then you meet the dwarven mining party, which is coming down the mountain slope on your way to Thay. Evoke, don't just describe. The little details and the big picture. So you can describe the world in general in big broad strokes, and you can describe the really nitty gritty details. Perfect example of this is the movie Labyrinth, where the nitty gritty details would be the little caterpillar guy that comes out and invites the girl in to have dinner with the missus. Maybe she could have. Who knows? But, you know, because she didn't pay attention to the nitty-gritty details, she missed a really important clue because she didn't pay attention to interacting with an insignificant intelligence. You know, she could have had a shortcut to the right place. She didn't roll her check properly. Who knows? Or maybe she didn't make a passive check. So evoke, don't just describe. Tell them what things feel like, what they smell like. You know, how cold or hot or whatever. Mix folklore into everything. This is a mystical and fantastical setting, and include the world of non-participating character classes, as I mentioned, so the off-screen adventurers. Also, it's occasionally fun to throw in a rival adventuring party. So, for instance, if you're going after a particular artifact, it may be that quite a few people have found out about this artifact at the same time you did, and they were going after it for completely different reasons, or maybe the same reason, or maybe a directly opposing reason. So that's always fun. And of course, talking to wizards and clerics and things like that, they'll have vastly different views on supernatural phenomena. You know, the wizards may be interested in learning its secrets and capturing its lore so they can reproduce the mystical effect in a controlled fashion. And clerics, of course, may be interested in suppressing any information about a thing because it conflicts with their mythology. There are, on that note, shapeshifters, wizards who polymorph. There's hidden ghosts. There's the undead that can mask themselves as the living. And they're the agents of the actual gods at work. There's supernatural forces at play. There is a world within a world within a world. Occasionally, one of these people, these things, may be discovered, uncovered. They may lead to the player characters chasing false leads because they act in very suspicious ways. Work out what touch armor class is in 5th edition. Like, for an object or a thing that just hits them. That's where dexterity becomes quite important. So armor class, the dexterity aspect of armor class is also your ability to angle your armor to take the impact of something without hurting you, or to avoid getting hit by that thing in the first place. Are the locals who need help even humanoids? Why do they even want help? So you may be approached when you're outside of your normal civilization by what could be considered a monstrous civilization who need your help. So the circumstances have become so dire for them that they actually turn to anyone that they think could possibly help them. And humans and elves and dwarves and halflings and such have quite a reputation as murderous and highly capable individuals among these populations. Why wouldn't they? Look at the general stats. Orcs probably have a very healthy, confused respect for humans. I mean, they're relatively soft looking, they come from this pampered existence, and yet they're so capable with magic and swords and things. It's perplexing to an orc, somewhat infuriating, but who would they turn to if they need help that's outside of even their shaman's ability to understand magic? Look for the floppy hat and robed individuals that are coming out of towns that are carrying books. They may be useful. So on that note, add local language and culture, not just what dwarves and elves and such sound like, but there's probably a lot of goblinoid language that is interspersed with the common that is spoken in that area. A perfect example is in a city that was quite close to a swamp that was also occupied by some lizard folk that were in a peaceful trading sort of relationship with the humans. Don't come hunting in our jungles. We will bring game to you for a reasonable price. There was some intermingling of language and culture. So by the end of that campaign, the players all knew that Haktis meant forbidden in lizard folk language. NPCs can be puzzles and they can be traps. A merchant that is very eager to sell some goods and equipment to the player characters may have a deal with some local bandits that they will inform the bandits when those individuals are leaving town, and the bandits will be paid a pittance by the shopkeeper if they bring the equipment that they just sold to the adventurers back to the shop to be sold again. So a passive check by a person who's skilled in armoring or blacksmithing or heavy armor use, they may note that these brand new bits of equipment have been adjusted to fit individuals. It's a passive check. Hirelings and scouts and guides and rescues, so people that have joined the party because they're on their own out in the wilderness and they see a group of adventurers and just join them because that's exactly what you would do. Retainers, mercenaries, and companion creatures are the DM's secret weapon for basically leading the characters in the direction that you want them to go. So is the hireling sort of upset and wants to rest for a minute in this particular area? Well, it's now become an encounter area. Do the scouts notice something that player characters normally would not have, or warn them of something which leads the characters to want to investigate? Do the guides advise them badly and lead them to a place which is possibly very dangerous because they just didn't know that the conditions had changed? Or do the guides have some folklore which is just plain wrong? Do the people they've rescued tell them about some group of monsters that are roving around the area that have attacked this settlement or destroyed their wagon? Or were they part of an adventuring party that was almost at their goal when something disastrous happened and this is the only survivor who is essentially now a living treasure map? Do the retainers stop and say, no, we're not going any further because it's too damn dangerous, and now you have to pick and choose what equipment that you want to take with you because the retainers were carrying most of it? Do the mercenaries turn on you, or have they got a secret deal that they don't fight a particular other group, or are they honor bound to go off and fight a particular group when they encounter them out in the wilderness unexpectedly because of some past grudge? Is that hobgoblin that you're about to fight actually the person who trained one of the mercenaries that you're in a group with, and the mercenary now switched sides? or decides not to fight with you. Companion creatures may run off. Ship's cat, for instance, leads most people on the Nostromo to their death because it happens to go hide in places where a huge slavering xenomorph monster happens to like hiding as well. Notice it never ate the cat. Smart alien, that one. So, they are the DM's secret weapon. The big bad guy's version of a hireling is an agent that is working against the player party. There's no reason why an agent which is hired by the big bad guy wouldn't masquerade as a scout or a guide or a rescue or a retainer or even a companion creature. Refer back to the kobold that I was talking about. Moderate the use of the characters being trapped, though, or imprisoned, or having their stuff stolen, or being betrayed by NPCs, or being confused completely by illusions, or by having their mind controlled. However, there is a secret technique that you can use, which is turning it to the player character's advantage. So, for instance, they can become trackers of something if it's stolen from them. They may have like a connection to an attuned item, for instance, that's stolen from them, and they can feel the direction of the attuned item. So there could be extra advantages to attuning to a specific magic item that you didn't reveal at the time because it's never left their person before, but all of a sudden, when it's stolen from them, they can feel what direction it is. They may be betrayed by somebody and then turn around and turn that person into a double agent who's now working for them against the enemy. They may, in the course of trying to escape an imprisonment, make a prison break ally who has secret knowledge about the big bad guy that would not previously have been revealed unless they happen to have a conversation with that big bad guy's enemy who they've imprisoned. Now, in the course of escaping from the dungeon, they've got a secret passage back into the dungeon through some other means from the ordinary. They may realize that they've been facing an illusion or have been mind controlled and are now faking it. So how could a bad guy who's been mind controlling somebody realize that that person's not actually mind controlled anymore? They're just masquerading as a mind controlled person, or they're just pretending that they can't see that this thing is actually not real. Magic items can break the rules of the game. They can do this to the player character's advantage or disadvantage, and you should be careful about it, but I would recommend also make them one-shot items as often as possible. So there may be many different limitations to magic items, like to the point where they may be limited in power because they're tied to a certain area. As soon as they leave that area, the magic which has powered them no longer works. This may not actually be obvious to the person who created this object in the first place. They may not realize that the magical item is tied to the power of a particular area. There may be a particular type of stone or something like that, which is emanating magical power that the wizard has inadvertently tapped into. They may have a one-shot item because they're based on some sort of quality of the character that is expended on their use, which takes a very long time to recover, but is otherwise unnoticeable to the character. It's some mystic quality, for instance, like a key point that everyone naturally has, which they never use unless they're a monk, that sort of thing. The non-combat initiative rounds are just as important as combat initiative rounds. This is a case in point where you have time-based events which are taking place, and this is quite often where skill challenges become involved. So, for instance, you may need to make successive skill checks to climb something which is in the process of collapsing or burning down or becoming covered in sleet and snow, that sort of thing. Like if you're traveling through a snowdrift, for instance, it's not just an ordinary snowdrift, it's going to be coming up to your thighs, otherwise you wouldn't have mentioned it. And as we hit the 45-minute mark, I think that's a good point to finish this first little broadcast. If you got any extra advice and things like that that you would like me to talk about and cover in future broadcasts, by all means, put them down in the comments. And if you've got any particular topics that you'd like me to talk about, any specific monsters or cultures or cosmology or non-D&D games that I've played, if you want to hear about specific campaigns and things that I've played before, this is definitely the medium in which you can ask me any questions. If you want me to talk about Warhammer 40k lore, specific monster races, books and movies and plots that can be used in your role-playing games, just feel free to ask, and I'll talk about whatever I want.